It's Sunday, April 17th, 2016, and this is the Product Mentor Talk. Today we're joined by one of our mentors, Vasu Vadlamudi, Director of Product at Oscar Insurance, to lead a talk on numbers and limits, balancing data and design in product management. So let me just briefly explain the format. You might see people jumping in and out along the bottom of your screen here today throughout the talk. If that does occur, those are other mentors and mentees from the current session of the Product Mentor program. Product Mentor is all about pairing up mentors and mentees for the duration of a session, 5 to 6 months, to basically make better product people and make better products. So hope to see many of you if you'd like to be a mentor in the program at some point in the future, as well as many of you mentees. So we're going to just kind of jump right into it since we've got a small group starting out today. And just for everyone who's joining us, whether you're joining us from YouTube or one of the other various locations where you can be catching this video in live, you can watch the video as well as post your questions in real time to the productmentor.com/live. And as you post the questions to that live section, what I'll be doing is I'll be jumping in Vasu as he's talking, and we'll get you the answers to those questions in a fairly real-time manner. If it's the more generic product management questions, I generally save those for the end of the talk. So feel free, but do not despair. I'm not ignoring the question. The generic stuff, the non-topical stuff, I keep to the end of the talk. With that said, I'm Jeremy Horn. I'll be moderating today. I'm also known as the product guy, and I run this product mentorship program. We'll hand it over to you, Vasu. Do a quick intro of yourself and take it away.
Great, thanks, Jeremy. So I'm actually going to be talking a little bit about myself in the presentation. So why don't we just jump into that? Great. So today we're going to be chatting about numbers and limits, how to balance data and design. Before we jump into that, a little bit about myself. So currently I'm Director of Member Product at Oscar Health Insurance. You may have heard of them. My journey into product management started several years ago as a consultant at Bain & Company, where I spent 3 years. 3.5 years at Zynga, where I was the first revenue product manager the company hired, and then sort of rose through the ranks to become Director of Product Management. Saw Zynga go through the growth phase, and then the rocket engines cut out mid-flight and saw them sort of stall. Left to go join Delectable, seed series startup for wine, where I was head of product for a couple of years. And then moved out here, did some product consulting, and joined Oscar recently. So just, everyone comes to this role from a different set of experiences. Mine's been a little bit more on the analytics and B2C side of things. So today we're going to be chatting about what's the problem, what is this distinction between data and design, and how does that rear its ugly head? What are some ways in which we can fix the problem in our everyday lives as PMs? And then a couple of resources at the end to help you get better at both. So before getting too deep into that, just a quick overview on what is a data mindset versus a design mindset. And obviously this is a bit of an oversimplification, but hopefully it's a bit of background that helps you out. In my mind, a data mindset, it tends to focus on users as groups, so in the abstract, as opposed to individuals. It tends to focus on solving problems by getting data or information that's measurable, that you can quantify, versus more intuitive sets of data. It can be, although it doesn't have to be, by any means of the imagination, incrementally focused. So how do I make this thing 1% or 10% better, not how do I make it 100 or 1,000% better via blue sky thinking. And it tends to be a little bit more focused on identifying and weighing different solutions against each other. So do I choose path A or path B when I want to solve this problem, versus focused on saying, hey, are we even asking the right set of questions? Is this the right problem, first and foremost? So these two can come into conflict in your life as a PM in several ways. So a couple of examples here. If you've been doing product management for a while, maybe you've heard some of these around the office. They're all kind of similar things. So the first one is sort of a design mindset, and that can be a designer. It can be an engineer. It can be you as a product manager saying, hey, numbers aren't always the whole story. Sometimes, as in the second example, it's more a numbers-based mindset saying, hey, like, what is this sort of person doing, saying, let's step back and talk about this at a completely different 30,000-foot level. And then sometimes the conflict is internal. It's you saying, I have a decision to make. I don't know whether to trust one approach or the other. So all these boil down to the same thing, which is there are going to be times when you're trying to make a decision or trying to figure out the best approach to a problem, and data thinking and design thinking will conflict. You need to figure out which one to lean toward and why. And this slide is just like another, maybe you've seen this floating around the internet. Replace the word project manager with product manager. It's pretty accurate. Every discipline tends to see themselves as the be-all and end-all of product development, and the other disciplines as sort of just necessary evils in the process of getting things out to users or driving business results. And it's obviously not the case. So where does this tension between data and design come from? For me, and this is the Vasu Vadlamudi theory of product management, so totally my take on things, not any of the companies I've worked at. There are sort of three traits that define a PM. One is we tend to be analytical. The second is we tend to be user empathetic, so thinking about what does my end user or interim user want from this thing. And we tend to be organized in terms of bringing clarity around structure to what we're building. What that means in terms of what we do on an everyday basis is we tend to do a lot of analysis, coming from the analytical side, kind of obvious. We tend to spend some time in product design, and obviously this mix varies by your role in your company and what it needs. But thinking through, okay, what are the wireframes that we need for this? Like, what does the end user want to see? Why? What are the steps that they're going to go through? And then we tend to spend some time on project management. So figuring out, hey, is this plan for what we want to build reasonable? Once we set the plan in motion, are we on track or not? And if not, why? How do we get better at implementing plans over the next quarter or the next several quarters? And so my thought on where this sort of conflict tends to arise is at the boundaries of these areas. So if design lives in the call it the product design area of your sphere of influence as a PM, there are two boundaries. Conflicts arise between product design and analysis, and to a lesser extent between product design and project management. And so here we're going to chat more about the intersection between that red area and the green area. So the product design part of your brain or part of your role is conflicting with the analytical part. We'll also chat a little bit about the project management side. And another aside, this doesn't fully encompass everything that the design team at your company does. So don't take this as, oh, like the designers are just a part of like product management and we do so much more than they do. It's not that at all. It's just this is the part of their world that lives in yours. So now let's sort of understand where these conflicts arise and what the types of problems that arise from them are. I want to talk about a couple of ways that we can fix it. First, I want to chat about general principles. So there are three basic ideas that I want you to keep in mind whenever you encounter one of these conflicts in your workplace. One is, think about the situation that you're encountering, the problem that you're trying to solve, and what that means for the mindset that's probably going to be able to bring more light to bear on the situation. The second is always keep in mind there are going to be a lot of opinions in the room. There are going to be a lot of different theories as to how to proceed or what the right answer is. Think about ways to settle those differences of opinion that are more on the objective side of things, or that will get the folks around you to be on the same page and get bought into whatever plan it is that you as the product manager want the company to move forward with. And then the third principle that you should always keep in mind as a product person is data skepticism. And we'll dive into that in a little bit. So for the first example, right situation, right mindset. Whenever you're dealing with a problem, different problems are going to be amenable to different types of problem solving. And so here I've listed a couple of different axes along which a problem might segment, and then sort of we can talk about how different mindsets help with each of them. So one example is, what kind of user base does the problem that you're dealing with have? So if you're designing a feature for, like a B2B user, that user is going to think very, very differently than a B2C user. So a B2B user, business to business, if you're selling, for example, internet security software to Fortune 500 CIOs, those purchasers are going to be very, very considered in their thought process. They're going to weigh the costs and benefits. They're going to look through the contract. They're going to bake off your product against several others. They're really getting into the nitty-gritty, and they have your product loaded in their heads. Versus if you're building sort of really casual consumer apps, those users, they're just sort of skimming off the top of the surface of your app for a couple minutes or a couple of seconds even sometimes each day, they're not really thinking that deeply about it. And so it might be harder to, it might be harder to say, well, let's just use a purely numbers-based approach for the B2C user, because you're going to miss out on what's actually going through their heads. You need to do a lot more research. Conversely, there are times when the numbers are actually better for a B2C user base, because they allow you to aggregate them and see what they're actually doing versus what they think they're doing. So, what type of user you have, who you're targeting, how they think about your product, and the extent to which they think about your product. That all relates pretty heavily to which side of the spectrum do you want to lean toward when you're trying to figure out how to solve a problem. The second area is product maturity. So if you're going from 0 to 1 versus 1 to 100 in Peter Thiel's words, that's a very different set of considerations. So if you're building something from scratch and you don't know what the right idea is, you don't have product market fit, you don't know what works and what doesn't, it's going to be hard to get data there. There's not going to be a lot of existing data. There's not going to be a lot of comps or comparison data you can use to figure out what works and what doesn't. And you're going to need to be much more amenable to blue sky thinking, just stepping back and saying, hey, maybe we're solving this user problem the completely wrong way. What if we did something insanely different, like solved it with user-generated content or a community-based approach instead of an algorithmic one? And that tends to be an area where maybe design thinking is going to be more useful than purely database thinking. On the other end of the spectrum is if you've got an established product that's doing really well, you know exactly what drives it, what the levers are. If you're going from 1 to 100, it might be easier to use a data-based approach because you have access to data and you know how to interpret it. You know what it means. You know what success and failure looks like for any given change that you roll out, for any given release, for any given set of user tests. So that's a second area. And the third one to always be thinking about is, who are my internal stakeholders? Who is it that I need to get buy-in from, or even who has the ability to shut this project or this idea down if they don't agree with where it's going, or the people who are going to execute on it, if they don't agree with what we're doing, are they going to execute it at a lower level? Like, is it going to be less of a polished product that people really cared about putting out to your users? And sometimes your stakeholders will be more on one side of the spectrum than the other. So, for example, a lot of companies tend to have CEOs who are data and business metrics driven, and so it might be that you need to think about how to make the case to that person using that language of numbers, A/B tests, things like that. Sometimes, a lot of your internal stakeholders may be more design-driven. They may be more user-focused. So, again, this can be anyone from a UI designer on your team to the front-end engineer who's saying, "Hey, I'm not sure if that interaction makes sense." Thinking about how to make the case to the folks who will make or break the success of your project is the other consideration to think about. And on a related note, you may be in a company that is more overall on one side or the other. So some companies tend to be very, very data-driven. Some companies tend to be very, very design-driven. Your job is to do two things. One is to learn the language that your company uses and excel at communicating what you think the right answer is in that language so that everybody is aligned with you. But two, think about, if the company does tip toward end of the scale, can you be the counterbalance? Can you be the person who learns a little bit about another way of thinking? So if your company tends to be really, really heavy on the numbers and business side of things, can you learn more about user experience and figure out a way to bridge those two disciplines to give them the best of both worlds? And that's a very difficult task, but I've found that in my career at least, the times when I've been that balancing force have been time well spent. Settling differences of opinion. So again, you're going to be working in software with lots of different types of folks. Product managers on your team, product managers on other teams, UI and UX folks, designers, front-end engineers, back-end engineers, business development, sales, marketing, you name it. You're working with all of them. And everybody's going to have a lot of opinions. It's critical for you to find a way to cut through all of them and not make people feel like they've been misheard, but find ways to bring some objectivity to that decision-making process. And so the two areas where you as a product manager can help are, one, what objective information can you gather before you start building anything? So before engineering or design or anyone actually starts, pushing pixels around or writing ones and zeros, what can you do to validate, what problem you're trying to solve or the solutions that you've come up with as a team? And this can be anything from survey data, user research, A/B tests, to prototyping, like different paper prototypes, click testing with different, trying out different messaging in Facebook ads and seeing which messages resonate the best with users. There are a lot of ways that you can run tests that give you some information without a whole lot of effort before you build anything. And this will both inform what you should and shouldn't build. It will also help everybody on the team align around the right answer. The second thing is, once you've decided, okay, we're going to build something, we think this is the right answer, how do you design that feature, or at a higher level, the roadmap of features, to generate insights and answers for you that you can then go back and say, okay, hey, here's what we learned about this. Let's figure out how to improve from here. Like, let's figure out who, not who, but which of our assumptions were right and wrong. And this has two great impacts. One is it helps your organization grow and learn, what works, what doesn't work, what assumptions do we have about our users that we can use in other projects or other features. The other thing that it does is sometimes you won't be able to come to agreement on a decision about the right way to build a feature or the right UX for something, and that's fine. If you can articulate to your team that, hey, we're not going to be able to agree on this fully, but I will build it so that all the assumptions that we've got are laid out, and that we're building it so that once it's live, we can get some data back and figure out where we were right and where we were wrong. That actually tends to solve the problem more often than you'd think. So folks will say, okay, maybe it didn't go the way that I think it is, but at least this person is open to me, or my opinion being right. And let's go back and discuss it after it's live. And if it turns out that we went down the wrong path, there is a way to fix it at the end, and that tends to make people a lot more comfortable with whatever decision you're making, which is, hey, like, there's a way to solve these problems afterwards. So I'm not going to freak out too much if I feel like we're going down like a less than optimal path at this time. And the last area to think about when you're trying to figure out how to balance data and design is data skepticism. So my background, going back to the beginning of the presentation, is a little bit more of an analytical one. Consulting, and Zyngo is known for its analytics. One of the most valuable lessons that I learned while I was there, though, was that the data doesn't always tell the whole story, and you need to be very thoughtful about what it means. So on this page, I've got like a simple mock-up of an A/B test that some enterprising Zynga PM ran several years ago. And this isn't exactly what he did, but it's very similar in spirit. So we had a dialogue on the left-hand side, which asked users to integrate to interact with a new feature, XYZ. And so there was a button on the left that said, yeah, let's try out the new feature, and there's a button on the right that says, cancel, I just want to go into the game and play my game. The A/B test was, hey, let's try swapping the order of the buttons. Very simple, so cancel is on the left instead of on the right. When we looked at the results, the variant group did significantly better. So this was the readout after several days. If 15% of users in the control group said, hey, yeah, I'll try out feature XYZ, but swapping the button led to almost 20% of them clicking, hey, let's try it out. This was a great result. The PMs on this project said, hey, like, we've got this interesting finding. We think that we can drive some amazing results for our team. We're going to be rich. I'm going to get that promotion to senior PM this quarter, or a bunch of other stuff like that. But and the other thing that they did was sort of like this question of like, where else can we apply this learning? So where maybe this is a thing that we can do in lots of other features, around our product or even across the company. What happened, though, when we initially started this, we were like, well, this is interesting, but I'm not sure if that's really what's happening. And when we dug into the data a little bit more and gave the experiment a little bit more time to run, and then also slice the data by
Vasu, looks like you're muted. Can you unmute yourself?
Great. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
I'll take this moment just to remind everyone, get your questions in. Go to theproductmentor.com/live, post your questions, and we'll get them on over to Vasu to answer them for you about this topic, or even things generic to product management. Take it away, Vasu.
Great. So, there were a couple of learnings from this experiment. One was always, when you're looking at big changes, try to figure out the impact over time and see, if users normalize to them and it's not really a change. But the meta learning is, design your experiments to validate not just business hypotheses, but also user-based ones. So, I think that the PMs who designed this experiment were very well-meaning, but they weren't thinking about, why a user would, just because a button's on the left versus the right, want to click yes more based on that one parameter change. And so hopefully, when you design experiments, when you design features, you're thinking about, okay, I have this change. I think it's going to drive user behavior to do X more because users will think something, and that will lead to the business outcomes that I care about, not just going straight to the business outcomes. Because if you're not thinking carefully and rigorously about what's happening in that interim step of a user's brain processing what you've built, you can lead to premature conclusions and outcomes like this one. So there's a combination of sort of art and tactics here when you're designing features, when you're designing experiments, when you're thinking about roadmaps as well. The last piece I want to touch on is, so we talked mostly about that intersection between design and analytics. I also want to talk about that intersection between design and project management.
So yeah, before you get into that, we had a question that just came in from some anonymous individual. And this person is asking, what is the best way to conduct customer research on a new product? How should you design the experiment differently to target the correct user group?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So one is, I think there's both experiment-based ways to test this out, but also I tend to be a big proponent of user research-based testing as well. So that's going to be less A/B testing and experiment based and more of a, how do I create wireframes, create mock-ups, maybe stitch together a bunch of prototypes into a fake app, and then show it to my target audience. And so that's two things. One is going out and finding where those people live. So an example from Delectable. So we made a wine app for people who are into high-end wines. Whenever we had a new release, we would go into a high-end wine shop and just grab customers and ask them to come hang out with us, and then show them different versions of the features of the apps that we were working on. And then, yeah, building out like a sketch product instead of building the whole thing. If you have built a whole product and you're not sure if you're targeting the right folks, then yeah, I think it's a question of going and finding a small set of representatives of those people before you go live to an entire user base. Otherwise, if you just push it out to your existing user base, you're going to be getting like the wrong conclusions because you're not looking at the right set of people, if that makes sense. Does that answer the question?
Does for me. So that's all the questions we have right now. Keep them coming in to theproductmentor.com/live. Back to you, Vasu.
Great. So, we mentioned the various ways in which design and analytics can interact at that conflict boundary. I also want to talk very, very briefly on a little bit about what have I learned about how design and project management can come into conflict. And I think the biggest area is oftentimes the release schedule, so your roadmap. So on this slide, I've got an example of a typical release train-based process. So call each of these rows is a release for your app. So, release 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. And then each month is sort of what stage that release is in. And so, say that this fictitious company has a one month release train cycle. So in January they'll be writing specs for release 1.0. In February they'll take those specs or PRDs or whatever you want to call them, and the engineers will actually start to turn them into a working set of code. And then March you'll release the code, make sure that it's safe, make sure that it's healthy, make sure that nothing went wrong, and then move on to the next thing. Simultaneously, as release 1.0 is in dev, you'll start writing the specs or the PRDs for the next release, and so on and so forth. So every month, the engineers are working on one thing, product design and to some extent engineering are working on the next thing that's coming up. or it's live and you're just making sure that's healthy. So this is how a release process works in theory. What happens though if release 2.0 has extra complexity around design consideration? So for example, maybe you're taking adding in a big feature that interacts with a lot of other features in your website. Or maybe you're actually just redoing the UX of your website entirely. Like what tends to happen if you try to jam that sort of project into this sort of release train? And one thing that I've tended to see is it causes a lot of problems. So this is what actually happens. So release 2.0, it'll take longer for you to write the specs or the PRDs and to get everybody aligned and to agree a little bit with them. But they probably won't get enough time to really align around these big questions of what should the homepage have on it. We had these 4 things. We want to take out 2 of them, but sales and marketing are screaming about you can't take the link away to like our direct-to-consumer sales channel in order to add this other thing. So you're going to have a lot of thrash on the design front. Eventually, you'll sort of throw your hands in the air and say, well, we've got something that's good enough. Let's just start engineering because they've been sitting around on their hands and they haven't done anything. And so engineering will start, and they start a little bit late in the middle of the month as opposed to the beginning of the month. But because the team is still thrashing on what the design is, and the more the engineers build, the more people around the company are going to see it and say, hey, wait, like this isn't what I wanted. Like that does this thing that's harmful, or I think that my team's input isn't being taken seriously. It's going to take longer to be in dev, and so eventually you'll get to this point where you're partly designing and partly developing, and this can go on for months. So originally, what was supposed to be a nice, clean 3-month process of design, build, validate ends up taking 4, 5, 6 months for these major releases. And in the meantime, you haven't even started on the next set of releases. So 3.0, 4.0, 5.0 is all sort of getting backed up at the station while this is happening. What's the solution? I don't think there's any one solution, but one thing that I've found that does help is just simply calling out, hey, this release has really significant design changes, or it requires a lot more thinking or a lot more validating about what our users want or what the data is telling us. Let's start the planning for it even earlier than we would normally, so that we have answers to these big questions that everybody is mostly agreed on, that then we can go and write specs around. And again, like this is not like the silver bullet that's going to solve your problems, but I think one, just calling out these things ahead of time, seeing and planning around them, and then 2, making sure that everybody's aligned around the need for extra time can save you a whole world of trouble later on. And if you don't have that time, figuring out ways to fight for it if you think it's the right answer, again, that's your job as a PM, or that, if you have a project manager or producer on your team, that's your job to get together with them and figure out, like, what is the way that we can make this happen to give the team the right amount of time to find the answer and let it settle before we start building anything. So, going back to that project management, data, and design triangle, this is a way in which you can use project management kung fu to provide structured ways to sort of solve some of these design conflicts.
So we have a question that just came in. I'm going to hand it over to Dagat to ask it.
Actually, I think you actually did a great job answering it. I was going to ask, does it make sense to have sort of a research phase before you write the specs? Because a lot of times once you write the specs, then, especially like I work for a 10-person startup, so if we find out that we're going down the wrong direction, and then we start testing with users and we're already like now in a release 2 schedule, we start, like you said, it starts to turn into a train crash where everything just starts backing up. What about the idea of like putting like user testing phases within the development cycle? So you build a feature, let's say you do a sprint of like a week or 2, then you test the following week while the developers are working on the next feature and doing something like that, so that you can sort of iterate on the, I guess that would still back up the project, but
no, I think that's a great idea. And it only backs up the project insofar as you haven't planned for it. So, if you want to take that approach, if you just tell the team, hey, this is how I think we should run this particular release, or you even just say, hey, this is our general process, which I'm also a big fan of, is, having like always baked into your process some time for user testing. Make sure that you catch bugs, or you make sure that you didn't muck up the UX too poorly. That's definitely a great solution to it. At the end of the day, again, it's going to kind of like depend on what rhythm your team wants to get into and like how much time they want to spend on it. But figuring out whether you want to do that user research before or after the PRD process and where it fits in, like there's no right solution to it. I've seen it done multiple ways. They're all useful.
Okay, and then sorry, sort of a follow-on question. What do you do? So like a lot of times in the research phase, you're using things like surveys or those types of tools for customer development, and there's always that classic problem of where users don't exactly know what features they're actually will use or really care about, and so they tend sometimes a lot of times the results of those surveys are skewed. Are there good ways to sort of anticipate where maybe you should go with your design instinct over what the data in the survey or something like that might say, especially early when you're developing a new product or you're in the beginning stages of a new feature or something?
Yeah, I think the thing with surveys is you need to be very, very careful about what you want to get out of them. Exactly to that point of like if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have asked for a faster horseless or like a faster horse or something like that. You can't necessarily expect to get great insight from a survey about what people want in the future. I think they tend to be useful in a couple of scenarios. Like one is where you just need behavioral information about what people like their existing behaviors, like how they solve. So let's say you're trying to come up. So we were trying to solve like how do you choose which wine to drink. I can't necessarily put into a survey, hey, we want to solve it this way. What do you think? But I can definitely put into a survey, how do you solve this problem now? Who do you go to? Like, what information do you take into account? And then use that information in trying to figure out, hey, does this set of solutions that I'm coming up with work? The other thing that I think you can get out of surveys is if you do have, again, if your audience is relatively sophisticated about what your product or your product space is, it will be more thoughtful about things. So yeah, if you're emailing out a survey to like someone who's like buying like a potentially $5 million software as a service product, they're going to be thinking very, very hard about that day in and day out, because if they choose the wrong $5 million contract, they could get fired.
Right.
I probably tend to believe that data a little bit more. If you're not in one of those two worlds, my instinct is generally, to move to building prototypes, building mock-ups, and showing those to a smaller set of users over trying to get survey data from a larger set of users. And it won't be statistically significant, but even if you just get like 5 or 10 of those sessions in and you record them and you annotate them and share them with your team, everybody will start to see and they'll start to come to the same set of conclusions, and that helps you out a lot.
Okay, thanks. That was actually really helpful.
Great. Our next question comes in from Furqan Hamid, and he's asking, when you have a very customized product for each market and change requests are coming in for them, what does the release plan look like for the base product?
Just to repeat that, you've got a lot of different requests coming in for different changes. What does the release plan look like in order to accommodate all sorts of changes coming in at different times from different stakeholders?
It looks like it's a fragment. There's a core product, and then there's all these customizations across these different markets, these different streams. And I think it looks like they're asking about what the release plan looks like for, I guess, the base product, the core product. I'm assuming that's the part that's in common with all the streams.
Yeah. Short answer is I probably don't have great advice to give on that, so I don't want to say something that ends up being totally wrong. Good luck.
Is there somewhere that you would recommend they take a look to try to get some more insight into addressing their problem?
Yeah. Off the top of my head, no. The one thing I can think about maybe is, that can oftentimes be a problem with managing lots of stakeholders who have an interest in that core product. And so figuring out how to get a working group together to like make sure that they understand what's going into the product and when, and then also having a release calendar that everybody understands and abides by, that can be like a start to it. Hopefully they're already doing that.
All right, cool. That's all the questions I have right now. Keep them coming in, theproductmentor.com/live. Back to you, Vasu.
Great. So, the last thing is I just want to have talk a little bit about how to get better at both of these disciplines. you know, I think that hybrids tend to be great, especially the earlier stage you are. So if you're in a small startup of like 2, 3, 5, 10 people, the more that you can think via different modalities, the better off you're going to be. As a PM, your role doesn't have formal boundaries. So, given that the role is broad, you should be too. The most valuable person, oftentimes, especially in a small startup, but even as you scale and you have a huge design organization around a VP of design, a huge product organization around a VP of product, etc., is someone who can speak the languages of multiple organizations and sort of get the right answer through, and then integrate the thinking across them to figure out, like, is this really the right answer? And a couple of examples here. So, we sort of talked about this before. One is, when you're designing or reading out an experiment, as a product manager, that's a very data-intensive way of thinking about the problem. But if you can also add a design way of thinking about it, which is, what can we learn about user behavior and their preferences, and then, pushing that back out to the organization. So, hey, here's an insight. That makes you significantly more valuable than just like, hey, here's like the results of the A/B test, and we drove the result up 10%, because now you're allowing other people within the organization to build on that learning because they understand it in their own language. Similarly, if you're a product person but you're designing a feature, how can you validate your design with numbers early on? That goes back to that, the question around how do you do user testing, how do you do survey design research to figure out like where it is that you want to go. So just I just want to close with a couple of resources that might be helpful for expanding your ability to think in both these realms. So Andrew Chen's blog, it's been around for a while. I think he still has some great, he's a product guy out of SF, he's now at Uber. He has some great essays on like, thinking about experiments, using data, like, visualizing it, and thinking about your product roadmap, things like that. There's a classic essay called Good PM, Bad PM by Ben Horowitz. It's a little bit outdated. It's very much in like the old school, like Amazon Netscape era of product management. But I think there's a lot to be learned there about, your responsibility for, the overall quality of what you're releasing and when, and how broad your role is. And then a couple of books that one sort of straddles product and UX, and the other is purely on the design side. Don't Make Me Think. Again, it's a little bit more from like the web, call it like web 1.5, 2.0 era of website design. But it's great at stretching your thinking around how to design for users to maximize usability and make sure that they get what they want, and make sure that you take this responsibility for getting them to do what you think the right thing is for them. And then the Design of Everyday Things, it's a classic. It's a classic for a reason. It's not only great in terms of design theory, how to think about design, but there's also just tons of great suggestions there about how to actually execute on these things. So how do you run user research and user testing? I think that's it's an enormously useful resource. So I would highly recommend reading both those two books if you've got the time. So with that, I just want to close, and we're open for questions.
Great. Thank you to our speaker, Vasu Vadlamudi, Director of Product for Oscar Insurance, for today's discussion on numbers and limits, balancing data and design and product management. A lot of great questions we had today, and a really great turnout I'm seeing online as well. And as always, the presentation will be posted to our SlideShare channel. And a big thank you from me, Jeremy Horn, the product guy, and to everyone else who joined us today, and the product mentor. Also, don't forget, if you're interested in being a product mentor, like today's speaker, Vasu, to product people of all sorts, definitely go and visit theproductmentor.com. Sign up today to be a mentor. Session 6 starts January 8th. And if you can be a that's when the next session starts. So sign up to be a mentor today, and someone will be in touch with you shortly. Also, if you're looking to fill a new product job with a great product person, visit our very own free-for-all job board at theproductjobs.com. And with all that said, see you guys all soon. Bye.